Hello, my name is Gretchen Goldsmith, and I'm a board member at Beacon Light Mission in Wilmington, California. When I joined the board, I learned a little bit about our history. It turns out Beacon Light Mission wasn't our real name. Our official name for more than 115 years, from 1905 until it was changed this year, was Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor Association. We were founded in 1905 in San Pedro, California, just a few miles away on Beacon Street, right in the heart of what was to become the Port of Los Angeles. We started by caring for sailors who were far from home. Now, I'll be honest, the name Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor Association seems a little strange to the modern ear. But there is a fascinating story about that name, and it goes back to the late 1880s when tall-masted sailing ships were the king. So today I'm interviewing Dr. Robert Danielson, who is one of the world's experts on the floating Christian endeavors. Academically, he serves as the scholarly communication librarian at Asbury Theological Seminary. In addition, he's an affiliate faculty member teaching in the areas of world religions and mission. Personally, he's the great-great-grandson of the co-founder of the Floating Christian Endeavors, Madison Edwards. So I can't imagine anyone better qualified to tell us the story about the history of the Floating Christian Endeavors and how we got our name. Welcome, Robert.
Welcome. I'm glad to be here. It's delightful to be here and talk to you and share a little bit of this fascinating history with the rest of the people.
Thank you so much. So tell us about Christian Endeavor, how it started and how it grew, because it was really a thing 100 years ago.
Absolutely. And you have to understand Christian Endeavor in order to understand floating Christian Endeavor. So it's very important that we kind of start at the beginning. Essentially what you had, and this we're talking in the late 1800s, the churches in general did not have any youth ministry. There was no kind of youth ministry going on at all. They had Sunday schools, so you had work with children, and then they had the regular church for adults, but there was this big gap that was missing in the young adult side of things, which in that time included people who were in their late teens, because a lot of people went to work at 15 or 16 years of age in that time. So they were adults in a sense. They were no longer children, but they really weren't being treated like adults. And so Francis Clark, he was a congregational minister in Maine, actually. He in 1881, in Portland, around Portland, Maine, 1881, he came up with this idea of creating a youth-based, lay-led organization, okay, which he called Christian Endeavor. It was actually had an even longer name than that. It was the Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor was what it originally was.
And they loved long names back then.
They did. They loved long names. And he founded this in 1881 in the parsonage of his congregational church. He basically called in these young people and he challenged them to create an organization in which they would be leaders, and they would do Christian ministry in and of themselves. And they would sign a pledge, and this pledge would be that they would attend the meetings, that they would speak at the meetings. They couldn't just get away with singing in the congregation. They would speak at the meetings, and that they would devise various committees and do different kind of ministry work. Okay, so he actually worked to kind of include them into the church. Well, this organization went gangbusters beyond what he even remotely expected. Okay, it got picked up by papers and spread around. Soon there were Christian Endeavor societies in Hawaii and in all the states of the United States and in Canada and then in Europe. And even today, there's still the remnants of Christian Endeavor is still active in the United States. There's a World Christian Endeavor Society that's still around. So it it went crazy. I mean, there are literally millions and millions. I think at one time there were over 6 million members all over the world of Christian Endeavor
Wow.
members. So that's kind of the context we're working with. We're working with young people who are being encouraged to think creatively about being involved in church work in their local churches. Now, we move on a little bit to a Christian Endeavor Society that was in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Okay, and this was a congregational church in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And in 1890, somewhere about 1890, there were a number of members of a Christian Endeavor Society there. Okay, it was one of these youth-run organizations. One of the members was my great-great-grandfather, Madison Edwards. And he was the son of a captain on a boat. And he, at the age of 16, he started going to boats in the harbor and asking permission to preach on the ships. So at 16, he was actually preaching on ships to sailors. And he was pretty young, as you can imagine, and it was all kind of a self-funded kind of thing. But this Christian Endeavor organization that he was with, the secretary of that was a woman by the name of Antoinette Palmer Jones. And Antoinette Palmer Jones lived with her parents right next to the telegraph office in Woods Hole.
So this is a young woman.
This was a young woman, very young woman. She was a seamstress and basically just lived with her parents. Her father was actually an inventor. He was blind, and so she had to help him as well. She lived at home and took care of the parents, but she was a young woman.
And just so people know, for those of us on the far west coast, we don't know what Woods Hole is. Is that a port town?
It is a port town. It's most famous now for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. You might hear that on the news every now and then, but it's right near the base of Cape Cod, the little curly area of Massachusetts that runs out. And it was quite a port town in its time. And so they worked out this kind of agreement where if Madison Edwards needed help on something, he would telegraph to Woods Hole, and the telegraph person would deliver the message to Antoinette Palmer Jones, and then she would organize the Christian Endeavors to come and help with whatever might be needed in organizing kind of this work to help Madison Edwards in his ministry on ships. Well, the more the two of them thought about this idea, the more they came up with the idea that, hey, this Christian Endeavor organization that we have might be really interesting if we could put it onto the ships themselves. So instead of just ministering to the sailors whenever they happen to come into port, maybe we can create Christian Endeavor societies actually on board ships. And so they wrote to the headquarters of Christian Endeavor, which at that time was in Boston, and got official permission to try and do this. And then they became known as floating Christian Endeavors. So they're just a small branch of what Christian Endeavor was, but they were focused on sailors and ministry to sailors in that kind of context. They weren't the only group to do this. There were also prison Christian Endeavors that started up. There were Christian Endeavor organizations in the Army and in different kind of ways of doing things around the world, so that they weren't the only ones to develop specialized groups of Christian Endeavors, but they were the ones who developed it for ships. Now, they were interested in government ships primarily because the government ships, or the ships of the Navy, they had more stable crewmen. So they would hire people for a longer period of time. And so the people were a little bit more stable. And the idea was, another point that you have to understand is at this time in the government, there were only a maximum of 24 chaplains in the Navy.
Oh, wow. For the entire Navy?
For the entire Navy, okay? There were only 24 chaplains. At this time, there was no YMCA. There was no other organizations that were involved. All of those organizations would evolve out of Christian Endeavor, basically, because Christian Endeavor was the first one to do this. So there were no chaplains on most of the government ships. And so the idea was, well, you know, obviously we're a young group of people. We can't provide chaplains, but we can help them organize societies. And so they took these societies, and you have to remember that these sailors on these ships, many of them were 15, 16, 17 years old. So they fell into this category. And so that's what they did. They established Christian Endeavor societies on individual ships. Mm. And in order to help them recognize each other, they adopted the whole Christian Endeavor pin, like the one that you're wearing.
Yes, I want to show, I don't know if you can see that. This is got to be over what, 100, 120 years old?
Probably. Yeah. And so they adopted this Christian Endeavor pin, and the sailors were actually allowed, even on government ships, were allowed to wear them on their uniforms. And this was a way so that if somebody new came on a ship and they had a pin, they could say, okay, this is a Christian Endeavor. Let's include him in our society. You know, let's bring him in. And so they signed a pledge, just like the ordinary Christian Endeavors, that they would hold these meetings, that they would speak at these meetings. And they added to it that they would refrain from alcohol. That was one of the things they added to the pledge. And so they would sign these pledges, and then they would meet. And the other thing that was added to the pledge was that they would write a note or a letter back to headquarters at least once a year, telling them of how things were going.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And so they established these kind of floating Christian endeavors. And by 1901, there were 6,000 members of floating Christian endeavors.
6,000 members. Oh, wow.
On 150 different ships. Okay.
Wow.
So there were a bunch of different ships out there that had Christian Endeavor societies. There were floating Christian Endeavor societies on the German Imperial Navy at the time and the Japanese Imperial Navy at the time.
Amazing.
There were floating Christian Endeavors who were involved in particularly the Spanish-American War, in taking the Philippines and in battles around Cuba. And there were Christian Endeavors on what's called the Great White Fleet that Teddy Roosevelt sent around the world. There were floating Christian Endeavor societies on these ships as well, a lot of these ships. So that's how it began, and how Antoinette Palmer Jones and Madison Edwards kind of co-founded it. Antoinette Palmer Jones would become kind of the head of Floating Christian Endeavor. She would become the president of it, and then I think she was called something like the World Secretary of Floating Christian Endeavor. And she was the one responsible for getting the letters and answering the letters and doing that kind of work as well. Madison Edwards went on to actually found a different kind of ministry towards smaller ships on Martha's Vineyard. He became founded an organization there and became associated with the Boston Seamen's Friends Society in ongoing work out there. And he developed a similar organization to work with men on smaller fishing boats, non-government boats. But he kind of moved away from too much doing with the floating Christian Endeavor at that time.
I'm sure that was quite a need too for, you know, the canal boats and the fishing boats and merchant marine. So I'm sure that's a big part of it. So, I mean, you've talked about the newspapers that started, that, you know, picked up this story. I mean, it's just shocking to me in a good way. I mean, I'm excited that this grassroots organization could start at a time when there's no internet, no social media, probably. I mean, you say there was telegraph, but nobody had phones, or at least, you know, probably none of the young people who were part of this. Mm-hmm. How did it explode so rapidly? And what were the cultural factors behind that?
Okay. Um, there were a number of factors involved there. The first thing I think they realized was that these floating Christian Endeavor societies that were on ships were always moving around, and so they were kind of hard to pinpoint where they were at any given time. And so they actually created two different floating Christian Endeavor societies. There were two different types, basically. You had land-based floating Christian Endeavor, and you had ship-based floating Christian Endeavor. Exactly, San Pedro is a land-based floating Christian Endeavor society. So these organizations, the land-based ones, let's talk about what they did. These land-based floating Christian Endeavor societies were, again, young people, which is why you don't see a lot of connections with chaplains or pastors or things like that. They worked with those people. They were associated with those people, but the Christian Endeavor itself was supposed to be a lay-led youth organization. And so the land-based Christian Endeavors were more focused on supporting whatever else was being done by the other Seamen's Friends societies in their work and in their ships. And so they would do things like they would collect newspapers and reading material, because if you're on ship for 6 months at a time, you don't know what's going on in the news. And they would give the latest papers and reading material to people on ship. They would have services and help arrange services on ship, but also services on the land. And not just services, but there were also social activities, because these men have been cooped up on a ship for, several months at a time, and they're far from their families. And so the land-based societies would kind of have social events, social times where they could actually just get together and have fun. And part of this was a way of keeping sailors away from the negative influences in port. Because at this time, your sailors, they got paid whenever they came into port. And when they came into port, there was nothing to do with they didn't have internet, they didn't have internet banking, that kind of stuff. There was nowhere they could deposit the money. And so what they tended to do was spend it. And so these economies spread up that were full of, bars, gambling, prostitution, all these kind of things, because there was a lot of money flowing out of these ships. And the sailors didn't have anything else to do. And so these social organizations were ways of bringing them together to have more wholesome entertainment, to keep them out of the bars, to keep them away from the gambling and the prostitution, those kind of things. And these land-based organizations of floating Christian Endeavor would know when a ship came in, if that ship had a sea-based floating Christian Endeavor on it, so that then they could organize to kind of have that group of people come and spend time with them in their social activities. They also did things like they would have places where they could read, where they could write letters, because it wasn't possible to get letters on ship. And so very often, if a sailor was sailing, let's say from Boston, and was sailing to Los Angeles, he would have to tell the people in his family, say, well, if you're going to write a letter, write it to the Floating Christian Endeavor at Los Angeles. And then they would hold that letter there. And then when he arrived, he'd say, do you have any letters for so-and-so? And they say, oh, yes, we have some here. I've had them a couple months. Here you go.
Wow.
So that's how communication was facilitated. Other organizations actually started shipping banks, ways that they were able to save their money without having a stable address, to go to. So there were things like that as well. But these were some of the activities that were really going on. And this dual-based system was really very useful, because someone like Madison Edwards could found a floating Christian Endeavor in Woods Hole. And if that ship was in Southern California, the Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor would know that, and then they would be there to help supply them with reading material, help them write letters, which they might write back home to send letters back to Boston because they were going to be back there in another year. They would be able to help them in emergency situations, which was the other thing. If there were shipwrecks, they would house the sailors who were shipwrecked. If a sailor died for some reason, they would have cemeteries set aside for burying sailors who weren't able to afford burials, or who had died at sea, or bodies even washed up from sea that they didn't have an identification for. So the land-based societies were involved in all of these kind of activities to try and help as much as possible ministry that was going on the sea.
Wow. I mean, that explains so much to me, because as I've been reading a little bit about it, I've been reading our handwritten board minutes from 1905. It's interesting how much we collaborate with other organizations. So, for example, we're always speaking at their events, they're speaking at our events. We have people coming in, according to the newspapers, you know, a different group coming in to our mission, you know, every night or a couple of times a week. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of territorialism. A lot of them seem to have the same board members, the same, you know, location, and they seem to be pretty collaborative with one another, which really amazed me. And you and I've talked about this before. One of the people who we collaborated with a lot was Captain Charles Farr, who set up his floating Bethel, his floating house of God, his floating church, on the hull of the old retired tugboat, passenger boat, the Warrior One. And, you know, so it's kind of an interesting thing. You know, it seems to me that Christians don't work together as well today as they did back then. I mean, I don't catch any hint of competitiveness when I read the news reports.
Right. No, they might have had different interests in some ways, but they were very collaborative. The organizations like Captain Farrar, and even some of the work that Madison Edwards did later, ties into the Seamen's Friends Societies, which were basically setting up chapels and chaplaincies and missions in the major port cities, so that you see those. And that's actually an earlier thing that began back in the 1850s. So they set up these floating churches. You find records of them in Boston, you find them in New York, you find them in Baltimore, you find them all over the place. But they were all like independent little missions, just kind of loosely affiliated through the Seamen's Friends Society. And they needed support from the local community. And that was part of the role of the Floating Christian Endeavor Land-Based Society, was to kind of help and support these kind of works that were going on. So I imagine that the Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor Society, while Captain Farrar was not necessarily a founder of it or involved in it in that sense, I imagine they were very active in supporting his work. So they would be the ones collecting the papers, doing the social activities, so that he could have freer time to go and do ministry related things that he needed to do. And so they probably worked in close proximity to him. Other groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which were very interested in the issues of alcohol, they would have obviously been involved. Very interested in social reform and things like that. So yeah, there was a great deal of crossover in what was going on here. The main thing, in a sense, to remember about the Christian Endeavor is that it was, of course, it was a way of harnessing the energy and creativeness of the youth in the church. So it had a function that was focused on the youth, and how could the youth then go out and support these other ministries that were going on around them.
So do you know much about the founding of our particular floating Christian endeavor? So we know we're land-based. Tell me a little bit more about our situation.
Well, I've tried to do a little bit of looking in the archives that I actually oversee as part of my job here at Asbury. Is the special collections and archives, we actually house the Christian Endeavor material. So it's still being processed because there is just so much material that came out of the Christian Endeavor work. So I haven't had a chance to go through everything, but I did look through some of their major papers, especially for 1905. And 1905 seems to have been a year that in California, at least, there was a very high interest in floating Christian Endeavor. In an article from March 30th of 1905, there's a report about the Golden Gate Union was decided to focus their entire annual convention on floating Christian Endeavor and their work for the coming year, and talked a lot about the socials that they would have and the services and things like that. And so they were very focused on that. Then in September of 1905, and your organization was founded in April of 1905. In September, floating Christian Endeavor itself always had an annual meeting, and they would have special pins for the annual meeting. It would be held in a special place, and I mean, it was really crazy. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of people would come from all over the country to descend on these conventions. And in 1905, the convention was held in Baltimore, and the Floating Christian Endeavor actually kind of won an award. They had these banners that they would give as awards. And Floating Christian Endeavor was given an award because they had created 9 new societies, more than any other segment. And of those 9 societies, 7 were afloat and 2 were ashore. So obviously one of those ones that would have been ashore in 1905 would have been the organization.
That's ours. That's us.
Right there. So, I mean, it was a very important kind of recognition for the work that Floating Christian Endeavor was doing. And 1905 was a very, very important period of time for growth in the Floating Christian Endeavor. There's also quite a bit written, of course, about John Mackens, or Makins, I'm not sure how you say his name, but he becomes an important person, and he was a character who kind of comes out of the Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor and seems to have been involved as a director there as well.
Yeah, I think he was really early on, I think starting in 1906, our superintendent. And I hope you're going to talk a little bit about his work in Nagasaki, Japan, prior to us.
I'll mention a little bit about that. The Nagasaki Christian Endeavor Home was really quite an interesting story in and of itself. It actually gets founded by one of these floating Christian Endeavor groups that's on a ship, okay? In this case, it was a ship that had gotten dry docked for repairs in Japan, and so they were there for a longer term than usual. And the Christian Endeavor group that was there included a man by the name of Carlton Jenks. And Carlton Jenks was the head of this Floating Christian Endeavor group, and he got very interested in kind of what can we do while we're in port here to kind of help Christian Endeavor. And so one of the things they found was that sailors who were in Japan, US sailors in Japan, didn't really have places to stay. They didn't have kind of the same kind of things that they would have had with a land-based Floating Christian Endeavor in the US. And so they decided to start the Nagasaki Christian Endeavor Home. And they actually, the sailors on this ship raised the money. I think it was the USS Charleston. They raised a lot of the money to actually build this, the Nagasaki Christian Endeavor Home. And John Makins becomes the kind of supervisor, the one who's going to run that. Interestingly enough, in terms of the story, this all happened in the 1890s when this originally happened, when the Nagasaki Christian Endeavor Home was founded. Carlton Jenks, after serving on the USS Charleston, he becomes a crewman of the USS Maine. And he was killed in the explosion on the USS Maine in Havana that started the Spanish-American War. And he becomes kind of one of the heroes of floating Christian endeavor. His name was mentioned quite often as being one of the heroes, because there was a floating Christian Endeavor Society on the USS Maine when it was exploded in the harbor in Havana. So he's very interesting. But John Makin's actually kind of gets involved in actually running this, and the Nagasaki Christian Endeavor Home becomes kind of the first of the Christian Endeavor homes. And as I understand it, the home in San Pedro actually is the third, after another one was founded in Boston. So it's it wasn't very common to actually have a home or an office building, in a sense, to house floating Christian Endeavor. So in that sense, the organization of the Southern California Floating Christian Endeavor is a bit unique from other floating Christian Endeavor societies.
Yeah, we offered bunks and food and reading room and all kinds of things, stationery so they could write home. When I was looking through some of the early minutes, one of our biggest expenses was postage. So we must have been sending a lot of letters for sailors back to their parents.
Right. And the bunks are important for people who might be in port but having to change to another ship. Or for emergency cases. I know in one case in my own family in Madison Edwards, he ran a reading room, a sailor's reading room on Massachusetts, and there was a major hurricane, and a number of ships were shipwrecked, and he had to house, I forget how many hundreds of men in his building. I mean, they were really all stacked together, and my great-great-grandmother had to cook meals for them and kind of feed them and stuff until they could figure out how to organize them and get them back on other ships and send them home. So having that kind of space to which to house sailors when they couldn't necessarily afford to stay somewhere else kind of becomes a groundwork, I think, for what Beacon Light ends up doing in working with the homeless. I mean, it kind of the people who are transient, who are moving from one place to another, finding a way to minister to their immediate needs.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect tie-in. I feel that we're doing the same thing now in 2022 that we did in 1905. It's just that we don't limit it to sailors. Right. Now our doors are open to anyone in need, and to this day you can pick up the phone or look at our website or whatever and get a bed, a bath, a change of clean clothes. And we help wherever we can, and help us, especially with people nowadays on the street. Maybe they've lost their ID cards, their driver's license or their Social Security card, and we help them replace those things. And so we're doing a lot of the same kind of work we did almost 120 years ago. So I've got a question for you. As I was going through some of the archives and the old sepia tone photos, I would find these pictures of Beacon Light mission. Back then it was called Sailor's Rest. We didn't change to Beacon Light officially until about 1946. And that was to reflect the fact that the people we were serving weren't just sailors. But I've got these pictures of all these perfectly dressed people, men dressed in suits and ties, and women in their Sunday best. And what's all that about? I kind of thought that we would have back then the same kind of, people that the guests we have now are really experiencing very painful aspects of homelessness, which is, not having a safe place to sleep or nice clothes to wear or even clean clothes to wear. So why do we have all these pictures of these well-dressed people at Sailor's Rest?
Well, it could be several reasons. They could be a social, that there are people from the community that are there, but also to remember that these sailors, they had a job. They didn't necessarily have a place to stay, depending on what was going on with the ship. So they had fairly good pay. So the sailors usually had money, therefore they would dress nicely. Most of the pictures I have in my collection as well from my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather, who continued the ministry actually on Martha's Vineyard, show people who are very nicely dressed as sailors, and they're noted on the back what ship they were on. But particularly when they came into port, port was the time to dress up. Port was the time you were free from the ship. You were able to be a little more, to be a little more of a regular person, and not stuck on the ship. So it actually became kind of a time in which to be a little more social and to recognize that you were going to encounter. I mean, at this time, most of the sailors were men, so they were hoping to find dates as well, in port. I mean, and these socials were very often, when the floating Christian Endeavor societies very often included women who were very much involved in this, in part because there was a mentality at the time that what a lot of these young men needed was they needed to feel like they were part of a family. And so the mission itself, by doing these socials, they would have, sisters and mothers and aunts and things or people who stepped into those roles so that they would not feel quite so cut off from family ties, by being on a boat with a bunch of men for 6 months to a year. They would have this kind of compassionate kind of family-related care. I mean, in various publications, for example, of the different societies and stuff, there were often these women who would write letters and things into the societies and things as the sailor's mom, they would be called, or something like that. And one of the things they frequently gave out at some of these socials, like Christmas or something, was what they would call a comfort bag. And a comfort bag,
I read about that. What is that?
It's usually just a small bag, because you didn't have a lot of room on board ship. So it was a small bag, usually handmade by some lady, and it would include things that were necessary for sailors on board ship, things like needles, thread to mend clothes, buttons, darning wool for mending socks, all those kind of things. And along with that would normally be a small New Testament and usually a letter from the woman who made it, saying, that she hoped all would go well with him and that he would, be blessed by this in his travels. And so these comfort bags were really quite popular, and they were one of those things that things like the Land-Based Society would organize, and they would get together and create these comfort bags and then give them out like at Christmas or at other times when sailors were in port and they needed some of these essentials.
Okay, so I've seen pictures in the early leaflets from like 1918, 1919, where they show sailors, with their hats and their beards, holding their comfort bags, and they look pretty happy about it.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing that, speaking of sailors, I was looking at one of the annual reports from 1919, and they had these professionally printed. They're very small, and they're only a few pages long, but one of the pages was dedicated to a picture of just a huge number of sailors. Remember, this is 1919. They're all wearing epidemic masks. They're all masked in the US Navy.
Yeah, the epidemic was a really major problem for floating Christian Endeavor. In fact, I would simply credit the end of floating Christian Endeavor to the epidemic of 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu epidemic, because as you mentioned earlier, there wasn't like this internet connection. And so all of you think of these thousands of members they had, and the one thing holding them in common that they corresponded with was Antoinette Palmer Jones, the secretary of the Floating Christian Endeavor. And she was the one they would write to every year. She would send out Christmas cards. She would do, kind of keep this, they even called her something like the sailor's sister or something like that. She had this kind of aura about her. And she died December 19th of 1918 in Massachusetts from the Spanish flu.
Oh, wow.
She died during that epidemic at the early age of 62. She was only 62, but she died from the Spanish flu epidemic. And that just took the leadership right out of the floating Christian endeavor. And because of World War I, which had also been going on, which of course isolated the German Imperial Navy, the Japanese Imperial Navy, and the British Navy also had floating Christian endeavors. It just kind of devastated floating Christian endeavor as an organization. So from after her death, we really don't see floating Christian endeavor kind of even disappears from Christian endeavor records. That organization continues, but floating Christian endeavor seems to vanish. And those land-based organizations seem to become, again, localized missions to sailors without that interconnectedness that was so important. And the ship-based ones also kind of fall apart, but they become organizations that have risen up, like the YMCA and other Christian organizations had kind of taken their place and become kind of more prominent. Salvation Army and others which were active on shipboard at that time. And also the fact that the US Navy realized the need for more chaplains. And so there were a lot more chaplains being put on in the US Navy, so that by World War II, there were hundreds and hundreds of chaplains on board ships. So the need wasn't really there for the floating Christian endeavor. So I think in large part what happened, out in the Southern California floating Christian endeavor is one of the few that actually kind of kept going. But I think after 1919, it becomes much more focused on the immediate needs around it and less tied into kind of Christian endeavor itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even though Makins was our superintendent from about 1906 to sometime in the early 1920s. He got us through the epidemic and World War I. And then he passed away, and our next superintendent was named Nethery, and he had been a communist who had come to Christ through a floating Christian endeavor. And so, no, I think he came to Christ through Salvation Army. And so he had a little bit different tack on evangelism, and of course the Navy wasn't as much a part of our port history either at that point. And so it's just interesting to see how it's gone over the decades. And when I joined the board, I was under the impression that this was just a men's organization, that I was one of the lone women who was part of the board. My parents had supported Beacon Light. One of their close friends had added a woman's shelter to what had started as just a men's shelter. And so my parents had always, cared about the mission. And so when I joined, I was under the impression that there really had only been maybe one or two board members who were women prior to me. And when I went back and I looked through the handwritten minutes from 1905, two of the founding board members were women. And that continued through the history of our organization. Now, I don't know when it kind of changed, but it was kind of fun to see that, and then to find out about Antoinette Palmer Jones actually founding it. Just amazing to me as a woman. Right. And we really are doing the same work. We are offering the gospel, and it's so fascinating. Nowadays, there's all kinds of places for homeless people to go. There's, bridge housing and other missions and things like that. And one of the things that they tell us, the bridge housing people tell us, is we can always tell a person who has spent a lot of time at Beacon Light Mission, because they've got the spiritual maturity and often the emotional maturity to be able to handle having their own home and live independently. And I just think what a great legacy that we have brought down, from these floating Christian endeavors, from Christian Endeavor itself. What would it take now for a new wave of youth-based missions, maybe a brand new Christian Endeavor, maybe not under that name, to happen in the United States and in the world?
Well, I think the model of Christian Endeavor is a very powerful model, the floating Christian Endeavor and Christian Endeavor itself. The model of kind of empowering people, lay people, not expecting kind of clergy to come in and run things, but actually empowering lay people, but especially young lay people, to say, oh, you can be creative. You can come up with ideas, and we'll be happy to support you. We'll be happy to encourage you, and we'll be happy to find ways of making your ideas come true. I mean, when you think that, Antoinette Palmer Jones was just a teenager, and Madison Edwards was just a teenager, and here was the whole Christian Endeavor organization in Boston telling them, oh, you want to try this on board ships? Go right ahead. You have our full support. We'll support you on that. And there were other teenagers, like I said, who did that in prisons, and in other places, in other ways. And the model of helping people who are on the move also really intrigues me. We don't necessarily have the same problem, although it still is an area really in urgent need of missions for sailors, because they still are far from home and those kind of things. But we have issues with, like, migrant workers, people who work in one location and then they move to another location and move to another location and another one. When you're living that kind of life, it's very hard without a stable, without a stable address to have, a bank, to get communications, to get letters and current news and information and things like that. And I kind of imagine, I kind of have a feeling and a passion for immigrants in that kind of situation. And I think, wouldn't it be great if you had, Christian Endeavor type societies among migrant communities where they could form these groups, just the same way that a sailor would leave one ship and go on another, and there would be another floating Christian Endeavor society and say, come join us, you're part of our family.
Right. So we could have, I'm here in California, so most of our crops in the breadbasket of California are picked by migrant workers.
Right.
I could easily see you could have a a Christian Endeavor base in all of these cities and set up for migrant workers. So speaking the language, helping them with, the culture and transportation, all kinds of things. It's really, really exciting. I want to ask you one more thing.
Sure.
One of the things I keep seeing in the literature is that this is completely non-denominational. How did that work out? Because you're there at Asbury's, which is Wesleyan, and how did this and it was started by Congregationalists. So how did that work? That whole non-denominational effort?
It worked very well at the beginning, and then it kind of fell apart. At the very beginning, when Christian Endeavor was just Christian Endeavor, when it was the only kind of thing, there were lots of different denominations joined into it. And when they had their annual conventions, if you look at their annual convention reports, you will find that there were special days. Their conventions would last about a week long, but there would be a special day when the Baptist Endeavors would meet, or the Episcopalian Endeavors would meet, or the Methodist Endeavors would meet, and those kind of things. So they had that kind of loosely connected idea there. However, it didn't take very long before the different denominations began to think, oh, we might be losing our young people to the Congregationalists. And so organizations sprung up. The Methodists started the Epworth League, for example, and they started these kind of imitations of Christian Endeavor, but within their denominations. And so that's kind of how Christian Endeavor itself kind of began to decline as denominationalism began to pull them apart and to pull people into their different denominational sectors. So it did work very well in the beginning, but it was probably one of the causes for the kind of the collapse of Christian Endeavor as well. Although, like I said, Christian Endeavor is still going on, and it's active in a number of countries still, very active in different countries. And I believe in the US, if I recall correctly, it's in Michigan. The headquarters are now in Michigan, and it's simply called Endeavor, I think is all it's called now. And it's, again, it's still a youth ministry kind of based idea. But no, I think you're exactly, it didn't work well with the denominational thing by trying to be non-denominational. But in terms of during the time it was active and in terms of ministry to sailors, there was quite a bit of non-denominationalism. Different organizations would support the missions in the ports because they didn't usually have their own missions. So those missions were able to remain fairly non-denominational. I know, my great-great-grandfather and his mission, for example, was supported by all different denominations because there weren't that many in the port. And I also want to say, we tend to talk about, people like my great-great-grandfather, but if you actually read the documentation, my great-great-grandmother was as much involved in it, and my great-grandmother was involved in it. There was a great aunt, a daughter of Madison Edwards, who I have a picture of her driving one of the boats, piloting one of the boats. My great-grandmother, I knew she actually was quite the mechanic and could fix things on boats, from what I understand. I grew up with my grandmother, who used to tell me all kinds of stories about the women of that ministry and how they did organize things, often behind the scenes, but were very actively involved, especially this whole idea of trying to be a family for the sailors. So my grandmother used to, she used to tell me stories. She remembered going skating with sailors, for example, and that they just all treated her like a doll almost, because she was like a little sister, reminded them of their little sisters or their daughters at home or things like that. So, but she remembers, different taffy pulls and remembered different taffy pulls and other kinds of social events that were held. And she was as much a part of it as her mother and her grandmother were. So yeah, it was great in that sense to really include, we do tend to emphasize the men who were the leaders of it, but really it was empowered and mostly run by a lot of the women in the communities.
As I was looking through the Los Angeles Christian Endeavor news clippings, I found that probably, oh wow, at least, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 speakers who were, supervisors of different aspects of Christian Endeavor were women. So this was, women weren't rare at all. There were a lot of them, and they were actively speaking. And up in San Francisco, women were actually not for, this is back to Seamen's Friends Society, they ran an entire sailors' home. And so for, I guess, decades. And so it's kind of interesting to see how involved people were at every level. Anyway, I am just so excited.
It's important too, just to mention and build off that a little bit. Christian Endeavor was also interracial. I mean, even in the late 1800s, the African Methodist Episcopal were involved. The African Methodist Zion Church were also involved. There are pictures of the conventions where there are African Americans involved in Christian Endeavor. So there were, and they weren't separated out. They were speaking from the platform and things as well. So it was not just interdenominational, it was also interracial from very early on.
That is just very exciting. I'm really so thrilled to get your to get the history of this finally. And I'm going to put this on the Beacon Light website and on YouTube. I hope people find it, because I have learned so much in the last few weeks of just researching this. And this is just, it's just a great story. And I hope that as Christians, that we can continue doing this kind of thing in the future, because to bring care to others, to bring the gospel to others. And that's really why Beacon Light exists today. So thank you for your time, Robert. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate being able to share this, the story, to be able to talk a little bit more about the history. My grandmother has passed away, but I remember telling my mother the other day after you first contacted me, and I said, can you imagine Madison Edwards' legacy is still going on in California?
Right.
And it's just phenomenal to think of it historically. And so I admire the work that you're doing, and I'm more than happy to help you connect to the historical side of it, and hope you have many, many, many more years of success in ministry. And so
thank you. How can people, you've written quite a bit on this. So for people who want to know more about Christian Endeavor and Floating Christian Endeavor, where do you recommend they go?
Well, the only thing that's out there on Floating Christian Endeavor is a little booklet I wrote on called The History of Floating Christian Endeavor, and it's open access. It's freely available online. Anybody can get to it and download it and read it. If they just search on Google Floating Christian Endeavor, Robert Danielson, it'll probably come up at the top of their screen. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them as well.
I'm so thankful for your time. I really appreciate this. This kind of brings our whole history to life. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the opportunity.